How do you measure carbon? How do you measure your carbon emissions? How big is your carbon footprint? 12 inches? 300 millimeters? I'm sure there's a way of measuring it. I'm sure there is. I'm sure we could ask an expert. Yeah, that's definitely what we should do. Because if we could ask an expert, then maybe they could explain it to us. Or they could just measure it for us. So we wouldn't have the bother of doing it ourselves. Because they're clever, aren't they, those scientists? And we need them, it seems, to explain the world to us. And we especially need them to explain those invisible problems, like carbon emissions. Because visible and obvious problems like, I don't know, discarded single-use plastic face masks are, well, visible and obvious. We don't need scientists and experts to explain that. And in the inverted world we now live in, those obvious problems are so obvious that they not only never get addressed, they never even get talked about. We are invited, no, browbeaten, into believing that these invisible carbon emissions are our greatest and by some margin our most existential threat. But do we know that? No, of course we don't know that. But we are assured that this is the case. By the experts, by the scientists, by the science, in fact. And this is the same science that told us that the needlework would stop transmission, that the current plague, also an unprecedented existential threat, definitely did not come from a lab, and that the Maldives, where they've just built a new airport, would have been underwater 20 years ago. Curiously, none of these things turned out to be true. But to question those quite obvious and demonstrably false claims makes one a conspiracy theorist or a COVID or climate denier. We all know that human activity does have an effect, and sometimes a deleterious effect, on the environment. That is often quite obvious. Plastic pollution, toxic effluent being discharged into rivers, and even just the aesthetic ruination of cultural and beauty spots by the sheer number of motor vehicles. These are issues that obviously need addressing, because their effects are obvious. And then there are things that one can witness and logically extrapolate into believing are much bigger problems. I once drove through the Mont Blanc tunnel in the Alps between France and Italy. It was at the time the longest tunnel in the world, and I was looking forward to the novelty of going through it. But even with all the windows closed, it was disgusting. It was 12 solid miles of exhaust fumes. And so, intuitively, it's not a great stretch to imagine that exhaust, or carbon emissions from the plant's over 1 billion motor vehicles, is likely to be a real problem. As I say, it's intuitive. And we trust our intuition, or we should. Despite being socially conditioned and civilized human beings, we remain at heart merely sentient animals. And we ignore our intuition, even when it is characterized as prejudice at our peril. But what we also ignore at our peril is our reasoning, and the evidence presented to us through our eyes and ears. We are invited to believe that carbon emissions, which we can't see, is a far, far bigger problem than the millions, nay billions of discarded face masks, which we can see. And because we cannot see how much of a problem excessive carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is, we have to take others' words for it. Because we cannot see it, nor fully comprehend it, we are at the mercy of others to describe the nature of the threat. They say the threat is enormous, unprecedented, and existential. And they're the experts. Who are we to argue? Of course, what they're also saying is that they are our betters, and by agreeing with them, we improve our condition. We become closer to them. We become better. But conversely, by disagreeing with them, we become worse. We become thick, stupid, ignorant, and of course possibly even racist, and then of course we can be safely ignored. How dare we disagree? So to come back to the issue of our intuition, my intuition was always that the amount of crap we spew into the air had to be having an effect. It seemed reasonable. I was taking note of my intuition and my reasoning to arrive at a conclusion that I could not get to any other way, on account of my relative lack of specialised training or education. But maybe that intuition is being used against me. During the recent plague, when the needle was being pushed so hard, both my reasoning and my intuition were telling me that I didn't need it. In fact, they were screaming at me to run a mile from it. But I was also being told to ignore my intuition, that it was just baseless suspicion. And I was also being told to ignore my puny and ignorant reasoning, that I was being irrational and unreasoning, that because I was so ignorant, I should outsource that to the experts. But there seems to be a selectivity to when I should trust my intuition and when I shouldn't, and that is to be decided by other people. Most of the time it seems I should not rely on my intuition, the evidence of my eyes and ears, but should rely on it when it chimes with what I'm being told by my educational betters, and when it is revealed that my intuition was right and the experts were wrong, should I continue to listen to them? When I am told that I must surrender my car, not travel abroad, not heat my house, and refrain from eating meat by those who take their private jets to far-flung foreign resorts in the sunshine whilst dining on the finest flesh, should I take them seriously? Because the main takeaway here is not the hypocrisy, which is of course off the scale, but that they obviously do not believe the things they are telling us. If they really believed that air travel was so damaging to the planet, they wouldn't do it. But they cannot control themselves. The luxury and the convenience and the avoidance of queues, delays, and contact with the hoi polloi that private air travel promises is just irresistible to them. As with the masking and social distancing during the recent plague, it was obvious to anybody that they, by their actions when their cameras were off, never considered the virus a genuine threat. It was all a pantomime. The climate scam seems just as theatrical. I have no real idea how much of a threat increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere really is. It is just one of those things that I'm told is true. There are many things that we take on faith, partly because to not take them as such makes our understanding of the world almost impossible. The world is a globe, or so we are told. We know that it is supposed to be true. But can I prove it? Personally, I can't prove it, although I can point to those who could. So without recourse to climatologists, scientists and generally self-appointed experts, what do we know to be true? What is it that our senses tell us? Well, for instance, we all know that traffic jams are bad. Maybe they're bad enough to threaten the planet, but probably not. But in a lower level of calamity, we know that they are wasteful of resources and perhaps more seriously, of time. Our lives are ending 1 second at a time, and most of us would agree that spending any more time than is absolutely necessary in a traffic jam is a shameful waste of life. We can also assume that even though obviously we are all too stupid to understand, quantify or accurately measure it, traffic jams are likely to be responsible for increased carbon emissions. So how about we do something that might go some way to solving at least two of those issues and may in the process significantly reduce the third? One of the towns near where I live, an old market town, is similar, I would imagine, to hundreds of similar towns around the country. It has several schools within its boundaries, some of them high-end fee-paying schools. Consequently, it is pure folly to go anywhere near this town between 7:30 and 9:30 in the morning, or from 3 p.m. to 6:30. But only in term time. During the school holidays, the rush hour vanishes, almost completely. The people who just go to and from work cause almost zero congestion. It's the school run that causes the problems. Hundreds of individual mums and dads individually taking their individual sons and daughters in their individual cars to the same half dozen schools in one town that was never built to accommodate that amount of vehicular traffic. And people just put up with it, as if it was as natural as the weather, as if there is nothing that can be done. Nothing, that is, until somebody comes up with the idiocy of low traffic neighbourhoods, or LTNs, which is essentially blocking all the roads nearby, thereby making the problem worse, and by many orders of magnitude. Or until they come up with the totalitarian sledgehammer of actually banning cars altogether. As with so many other things, most notably the illegal immigration issue, the reasonable mitigation is never tried. Nothing, it seems, can be done about the boats arriving until some control freak in central government comes up with the brilliant idea of digital ID cards for everyone. So because the border force cannot, or rather will not, stop the boats bringing in illegal foreign migrants, the native British population has to be put under even more surveillance. Likewise, since nobody is attempting any sensible measures to address the debilitating traffic jams all over the country, primarily caused by the school run, this inaction is likely instead to result in extreme totalitarian measures. But the school run traffic jams could be addressed, and without resorting to freedom-destroying authoritarian policies. One of the ways in which this could be done is to insist, as far as is possible, that all children must go to school, to and from school, either by walking, cycling or by public transport. There is, of course, an element of compulsion in this, it is true, which does go against my instincts. But the way to achieve this is not to have legislation banning the use of cars on the school run, which is authoritarian and not to say impractical, but by making the school transport so good that very few people would even consider driving their own kids to school. I know that this used to be policy in North America, and then it has gradually fallen by the wayside, for reasons I'm sure are varied, but it should be tried again with renewed vigour. Because what's the alternative? The virtue signalling insanity of LTNs, or worse, the banning of cars altogether. Forever. And for everybody. Everybody except a select few, of course, as usual. And there would be other benefits. People could spend their time more productively. Shoppers wouldn't avoid the town. There might be more social cohesion by forcing kids from different schools together, a touch more independence, rather than relying on dad's taxi. And it is a sure thing that the dreaded carbon emissions would be reduced. But no, nobody is trying that. Instead, we're all guilt-tripped into believing that we're all killing the planet and are therefore utterly deserving of having our freedoms removed. And where have we heard that before? So my intuition is that obviously wasteful practices like traffic jams are being ignored, whilst invisible and nebulous issues like the amount of a trace gas in the atmosphere is focused on with a demented obsession. Mitigating the negative effects of traffic jams is not beyond the wit of man, but reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere may well be. It is something that my intuition tells me is very unlikely to succeed, which means that they'll just keep trying. As Orwell said, the war is not meant to be won, it is meant to be continuous. However, my mistrust of everything our government and our institutions do or even propose to do, and I don't think I'm alone here, prevents me from acquiescing to almost any proposal, no matter how sensible it may be on the surface. For instance, in theory, I wouldn't be against the plan to say something like, in 1 year's time, nobody will be able to drive a private car on a Tuesday. You have 365 days in which to make alternative arrangements in how you're going to get around. I think it could be quite nice if there was 1 day a week where there are no cars, particularly in cities. And I say that as someone for whom driving is a favourite activity. I'd be in favour of that in theory, but you just know, as sure as night follows day, that they wouldn't stop there. because then it would be Thursday as well, and then Sunday, and then every day. And of course exceptions will be made for politicians, for the rich, so that it will be the great bulk of the population forced off the road, leaving it clear for the parasite class at the top. And I won't comply with that kind of thing. I won't sit by and have everything slowly taken from me. It's now got to the stage that, since I consider all authority to be my enemy, I won't help them with anything. I don't even recycle anymore. Not because I know that it all ends up in landfill anyway, which it does, but because I know that if I do anything to help them, I know that I am contributing to my own demise. I won't help them, not with anything. The best that they can expect from me is that I will ignore them. For instance, I've decided that I absolutely will not intervene in any way if I see a bank being robbed, for instance. I will not help the police with anything. I won't actively help the bank robbers, but I'd never dob them into the police. Because it seems to me that the problems are allowed to get out of control, completely so, before any mitigation is even tried. For instance, I often thought that our ability to fly anywhere in the world and effectively treat the entire globe as our own back garden was a bit excessive. And I especially thought this when I still believed in the spectre of carbon emissions, and I fell into that trap. It was convenient to my worldview to believe that, because since I enjoyed driving to Europe, I was not one of the guilty ones endlessly flying to Rome or Benidorm. I reasoned that I could travel to Istanbul by Rolls-Royce, by myself, and I would still be using less carbon than somebody crammed into an EasyJet 737. But I stand by my instinct. International travel is a privilege. And I don't say that to suggest that it is a privilege to be arbitrarily restricted by someone else, like the Pfeffel's even more vile father, Stanley Johnson, has recently stated. I just mean that it is a privilege that we should be mindful of, something that was not available to our grandparents. But it is a privilege provided, not by governments, but by aeronautical engineers and various types of capitalists, just as the roads are not provided by governments, since they have no money of their own. They are provided essentially by the taxpayer, by us. But I am just as guilty, in a similar way, as those bright young things who insist on 4 or 5 foreign return flights a year. I think little, but perhaps a little more now, of driving 1.5 miles to the local garage because I've run out of milk. Having and driving my car is a privilege, but it's not one that has been provided by the largesse of government. Still, we are encouraged to respect that government and to believe that those in government and the functionaries in the civil service are just ordinary people like us, just trying to do their best. But politicians have proven themselves, by and large, to be far too interested in the prestige of being a member of parliament than they are in making their constituents' lives better. The civil service, for decades promoting itself, laughably, as unsullied by corruption and of speaking truth to power, has in turn proved itself as nothing more than an anti-British enforcer of woke groupthink, whose members repeatedly resort to hissy fits and whining about bullying when instructed by their elected masters to do the jobs they are paid to do, as if they were 5 years old. So why should we listen to them? Why should we listen to scientists who have told us demonstrable untruths, if not outright lies? Why should we listen to economists who appear surprised that spending £500 billion on paying people to not work and not produce might possibly have caused all this society-wrecking inflation? Why should we listen to doctors who tell us that men can have periods and that this is a woman? Why should we trust the courts that allow male sex offenders into female prisons just because they put on lipstick and a dress? Why should we listen to police officers who believe that 12-year-old girls can be prostitutes? Why on earth should we listen to anything they tell us when everything they tell us is quite obviously in conflict with what our eyes and ears are telling us? when they have proven themselves so categorically to be at best seriously mistaken and at worst to be repeated and pathological liars, why should we now take them at their word that the world is ending? When we are told that the only solution to climate change is for us to live in unheated homes, to forego our physical liberty by giving up our cars, to abandon our human curiosity by denying us the ability to explore the world we live in, and for us to be fed some lab-confected slab of God knows what, rather than a nice juicy steak, I would like them to be sure. When the solution to saving the planet is to remove almost everything that makes life worth actually living, I really would like them to be sure. So far, based on their previous history, I remain unconvinced.